Have a seat on your porcelain throne. It's time to talk some shit on the Powell movement.
Welcome to the Powell movement. I'm your host, Mike Powell, and another week, another crab feast. While we had beginner's luck the first week and we caught 10 huge crabs that were mostly Dungeness, this week was a little tougher. We were more prepared. We had everything compared to last week. Last week we used goggle bags for bait and we were total rookies. But now we have all the gear and we came up with like 8 rock crab. They're good, but their shells are so thick and they have so many channels in the body that it makes getting the meat a pain in the ass. But it was better than getting no crab. The funny thing about all this is how we crab. My buddy was given a Hyperlight Tri-Tune dock. It's meant for a lake. And he keeps that thing out on the Puget Sound 24/7. And when we paddle out, we are literally paddling out a 10 by 10 float that isn't intended for, but can handle big ocean waves. On our last pull of the crabs the other day, we look like total idiots out there in insane conditions paddling something that's as big and maneuverable as a couch on the water. It was full-on life jacket conditions, but I will say, crabbing is a fun new hobby, even when we make it dangerous. While I still feel terrible about killing the crabs, when I eat them, I totally forget about it. So podcasting and crabbing is what I've been doing lately. I'd say hanging out with my kid, but he's been either out of town or at a sleepover all but about 5 nights so far this summer, which is why I've had to pick up this new hobby of crabbing. Teenagers, am I right? Anyway, he's done with us for right now, and I'm done talking about my life. My guest this week has had a much more interesting life than I've had. Tina Basich is a pioneer, a legend in snowboarding who paved the way for so many snowboarders, and she did it with style. And this podcast dives into her unique early life, where you kind of get an idea of where her style and the way she does things comes from. I'm not going to spoil any of this for you. What I am going to do is ask you to do some things for me. First, please tell a friend about the show. Podcasts are really hard to find, and I'm not some famous person, so I'm even harder to find, but I'm better than most of the crap out there, and your friends deserve to hear the best podcasts, so please tell them about this show. Also, something no one ever does is share my social posts. So please do that, as I hear that also helps podcasts grow. But I'm not really sure, because no one shares my Powell movement shit. Finally, please check out my sponsors and buy their products, as they're the reason this show is happening. I only work with the best, and they are Stanley, Rollerblade, Elon Skis, Best Day Brewing, and Peter Glenn Ski and Sports. Now, it's time to chat with Tina Basich. Over the years, the treatment of women in sports has been a roller coaster. One event has equal prize money, one event doesn't. An average male rider doesn't get the exposure or results that a top female rider does, but that male makes more money. Were these type of things common in the early days of snowboarding?
Some of these things, like issues like that, I look back on my career now and recognize more of what I was going through than I did in the moment. I was a teenager and going into my early 20s, being a young adult, and life was so exciting. And I got to snowboard and I got sponsored and I was living my dream. And snowboarding was so new back in the early days that when I went to a contest and there would be 20 guys entered and there'd be 10 amateur guys entered, and then there was 4 women total. So we would have women's open division, and back in the early days, we were winning skateboards and hoodies and things like that. And so once the money started coming in and sponsors started coming in, I was stoked to win $5,000 at the X Games. And then maybe the guys was different, or maybe there's competitions where it was different. But I was just so grateful for all of it. I didn't recognize the exact moments when it was unequal and when it wasn't until I started to look back and realize a little bit of it. And I remember conversations of like, hey, we need more prize money. But in the same sentence, we were like, hey, we need more girl participation and bringing more girls into the sport. So that's kind of a hard question for me because I don't remember like putting my foot down.
Were there any women willing to fight, or was it more like the sport's so new and everyone's just happy to be there?
The things that I remember are that we wanted better prize money. We wanted to be included in the same events as the men. So the fight that I remember wasn't so much of demanding that we get, well, it's hard. How do I explain that?
Well, you had the Arid style in like 1994,
Yeah.
and you went up to that one, and they were pretty much like no women allowed, and you went for it, and
Yes.
you did what you had to do. That, I believe, was in Europe. Was it worse in Europe how they treated women, or is it worse in the U.S., or could you tell a difference?
That's the part that I have trouble with, because you say treating women. Was that the way they treated women? And it's, for me, like, I had so much support and respect from the men in the industry and competitors and peers and support and friends. Like, I was a tomboy growing up. I was in my element hanging out with the dudes. That was just normal to me. So when competitions came up where there was starting to be more women involved, and then at competitions, they would have a big air contest, kind of mid 90s when the big airs came through, and they would have a big jump and then they would have a little jump. And basically that little jump was made for the women and the big jump was made for the men. But for me, stepping up to that situation, I was like, I want to jump the big jump. I'm scared to death. I'm going to break myself. I'm going to pee my pants before I even take off, like freaking out over the big icy jump, but recognizing that power that snowboarding gave me was that I was on fire when I was on my snowboard. Like, I had a fire lit under me to not only feel all the feels that snowboarding brings to me and the highs and the thrill of snowboarding, but it also lit a fire under me to prove myself, because we were the underdogs. We were like the outcasts, and the skiing industry didn't give us any credibility and ski resorts didn't allow us. And so there was all this negative push against snowboarders in general. And then here I am, a girl who's not expected to do what everybody else is doing, like at the competitions for men, or backcountry filming things up in Alaska. Like, I'd be up in Alaska and Marco would pick out some big cornice jump. The film crew would set up for it. So I'm either going to jump it or I'm going to wait for them to be done so they can go set up on this little one over to the left. Like,
Right.
no, I'm going to jump the big one. So the driving force for me was to prove to myself that I could do it, take the challenge, and prove to others that it was possible for a woman to jump off that jump or to do that trick, and that we are totally capable. And that earned respect and started to flow more, where women were getting more coverage. And then they were like, oh, we better have a women's division. So there was a couple times throughout my career, like Shannon and I walking up to that Erin style in Innsbruck, you know, we were just scoping out the jump, checking it out. It was an invitational thing. There were only men invited. And we were in town for another World Cup halfpipe event. So we cruised over to this event to check it out. Sure enough, the organizer came over and said, sorry, no women allowed. And that's all we needed. Like, little triggers like that. We're like, oh, hell no, did he just say that? And we went and got our stuff and went and jumped that jump. And seriously, Shannon and I were like, were you wanting to do it? Like, I really kind of didn't want to jump it because it looked like we might die, but we had to at that point. And so there was another example of that at the X Games. In the early years of the X Games, they introduced the big air. This is a time, if you can imagine, when snowboarding did not have jumps and slope style snow parks at ski resorts. There was nowhere to practice. So when you show up to the X Games, the biggest jump you've ever seen in your life, and you're expected to do your best on it in that moment, and you get 1 day of practice or two, whatever 3-hour session you get of practice. So back in those days, my best trick at that time was a 360. I was maybe working on some other things, but hell no, I wasn't going to do it off a 45-foot jump that was icy and off axis. I've never even gone that big before on a kicker,
right,
on a slope style course or anything like that. So that jump was so intimidating that the field of 20 women, everybody backed out. Like, nobody wanted to jump the jump. And we went in, and I remember there was kind of a meeting, and we were complaining about the jump. And overnight, I believe they built a smaller one next to it to try and please us, I guess, because we were complaining about it. But what happened is that 16 girls decided not to do it, and 4 of us decided to jump the jump. And that was a moment where if we wouldn't have pushed through and collectively said like, hey, we've got to do this competition. Otherwise there's not going to be a girls division next year. And so I got third place at that event and won my first X Games bronze medal and pushed through. And the big air became a big part of the X Games. But, you know, back then there was also shovel racing. It was just kind of all forming.
It was a little kooky back then.
Yeah, it was a little bit of what works, what doesn't. And so moments like that is when I had to step up and others also stepped up collectively to just make sure there was a presence for women. And we wanted to inspire other women. That's just a natural thing that women have. Like they are caretakers or they are givers or whatever naturally is in us. And I was stoked when other girls would come up to me and say like, I saw your picture in a magazine and I ride because of you, or things like that happened where you just got pumped up and just wanted to keep pushing on for yourself and for that feeling of inspiring other people.
Crazy thing when you see the pool of competitors at that X Games go from 20 to 4, but really that's where you paved the way for the rest of your career. Well, before that you were known as like a half pipe rider and a bunch of different things, but that's when big air becomes your forte and really defines the rest of your career. But I'm still going to talk about men and women and snowboarding at that point. How about the most unfair thing that you had to deal with in terms of blatant sexism? I've talked to a bunch of skiers and they've been at the top of like a heli line and the owner of the heli operation comes up and is like, actually, I know you want that line and you got a film crew here, but I'm going to take it because I'm the dude and it's for me. Have you experienced shit like that too, or just people think they're better because they're men?
Maybe I've been lucky. I haven't had the experience where somebody has told me, you're a girl, you can't do it. And then I really didn't do it. Like whenever I was met with that, I just stepped up and dropped in. So all my filming experiences up in Alaska, like there were film crews that I wanted to get on. In Utah, there would be film crews where we would see them in the backcountry and we rolled up and they would not let me jump the jump, and mainly because they thought I was going to bomb hole out the landing. They might have trusted that I could go off the jump, but they were filming. You have to stick the landings to get a filming shot. It's not photos and just huck yourself off anything to get the shot kind of thing. Like there were film crews that I wanted on that I couldn't get on. And the people that accepted me and worked with me, I'm so thankful. And that was the crew I was supposed to be with, like Justin Hostenik and Richard Chesky back in the early days. And being with those crews that really believed in your riding and had the patience to work with you to push your riding abilities, that's the crew you're supposed to be with. The people that wouldn't let me on their film crew, even though they were staying at my house, I couldn't go up with them the next day because they had their dudes and they were all gnarly and they were going to build the gnarliest shit and they were going to go for it. And they didn't want a girl who had to warm up to it or ruin the landing or whatever they thought I was going to do. So it's kind of like where you fit in. It's, I mean, even when you pick your friends, like you pick the people that support you the most, you pick the people that uplift you the most. Like that's the situation that you work best in. And so I felt lucky to find those groups of people that I felt comfortable with and that were pumped on me pushing my abilities to the fullest. So I would be in Alaska with Justin and we would be scoping things. I was completely in every conversation of where we went that day. You know, there was only 4 riders or 3 riders in some points in some helicopters. And I was one girl and, you know, some gnarly French dude and Mark Frank. Like we were going for it. And that group of people, I always felt comfortable. I would be at the top of the mountain and they'd say, hey, Tina, you want to take this one first? And it was like a first descent. Nobody'd ever been down this mountain. I got to name it when I got to the bottom and they would throw it my way. So I feel lucky in my career that I had such a feeling of support and no regrets of how I led myself through my career. And naturally, I'm going to gravitate towards the people that support me and gravitate away and push away from the people that don't. So maybe naturally, I just wove myself through those barriers and gravitated towards the ones that supported me fully.
It sounds like for the most part, that the people that are causing problems in terms of gender in snowboarding are the people that are running events, that are people are like, hey, we're not going to put our money on the women's side of the events here. And with the film crews, for the most part, you align yourselves with the right people, and that takes gender out of it. And behind the scenes, when you're talking about the people who are working the desks in the snowboard industry, the one area where I feel like it's really transparent and you don't have any sexism or that much sexism is behind the scenes in the business of snow culture, because it seems like there's been so many women that have so much impact that have worked the desk jobs in snowboarding. And is there almost like it doesn't matter about gender when you get into the office of snowboarding?
Well, it's hard because when you look at it as an overall industry, I think it's the same equation that just is overall in the world. I mean, we're in a generation where women step up and run companies, like we're not held back, but that's not the history of women, right? So there were instances in the industry like Shannon Dunn's pro model coming to Sims. Her pro model was an idea that she had with her team manager and marketing director, Galen Nagel. They had the idea to launch a pro model. It was the same year that I had the idea as well. Of course, Shannon and I are like joined at the hip, so we're going to do things together like that.
Were you best friends when you guys both put out pro models?
Yeah, we were best friends. We were traveling the world together. We were doing the same events. And so here's Shannon and I living our best life on tour, getting our expenses paid the whole way, getting paid for snowboarding. And then we have these ideas to launch women's equipment. And that wasn't just because we wanted a board with our name on it. We wanted a board that fit our bodies because we wanted to learn better tricks. Like we were spinning 360s and we were doing these tricks, but the women in general, we kind of got stuck on the 360s. Nobody had pushed forward past that immediately. And there was kind of a year or two or so where everybody just spun 360s and there was nothing else happening. And part of it was that we were on these huge fat stance, big stance, heavy snowboards. And if you weigh 95 pounds, like you can't spin that thing around off a jump. You'd have to get huge airs to get, we just weren't there yet. The circumstances hadn't come together with the right equipment. Everything hadn't come together yet. So part of the need was that we wanted equipment that fit us so we could do better tricks, flip it around more, maybe start doing some stuff that hadn't been done yet. So when Shannon and her marketing director, Aileen at Sims, presented the idea to Tom Sims, the answer was no. And they said, we can't sell a women's board. And then Galen put it out to the reps. We're thinking of launching this board. Do we have your support? And it was a negative response of they did not think they could sell a women's board. And so Galen had this brilliant idea, being the first of the first, launching this as a mainstream marketing ad with the board, the marketing behind it, the whole push in the US. And she got a negative response. And Galen, what she did, she's a doer and powerful woman and thinker and can see the goal. And she told Sims that she would fund with her own money the cost of the mold if it didn't sell.
That is so crazy.
Like they'd want to try it, but let's just put pretty graphics on a board we already have. That's not what we were after. We wanted a board designed for a woman. So she put up her own money and said, I'm banking on this. I believe in this. And sure enough, they finally launched it. They got in an ad at the end of the year with a first pro model graphic on the back cover of the magazine. It had sunflowers on it. It was girly as we wanted it to be. And it launched, and that single thing changed and shifted the industry because it became the best-selling board that year. It outsold Sean Palmer's pro model.
Whoa.
Blew everybody's mind that happened. Proved that there was a piece of the pie for women's specific equipment. My pro model at Kemper launched the same year and didn't have the same sales as hers, but my board, I was more goth and had this castle on the board. It wasn't so girly, but Shannon's lead led into that movement of we can be as girly as we want. And that started everything to shift. We launched the prom clothing. We did not hesitate to make it in pink and lavender and mint green pastels with butterfly logos. And our ads were us dressed up in vintage 50s prom dresses. And then next to it would be a cliff jump of us charging in like pink outerwear. Like everything shifted. And then everybody started to give and try a little piece of that. And sure enough, the women's specific gear just boomed. And that was because of these women like Gayleen Nagel, who pushed and said, no, we have to do it. And I'm willing to put my money on the line for it. And so if that wouldn't have happened, it could have been 5 more years until somebody tried to launch that. Like it would have taken longer. So I'm so thankful when I look back and realize like all these moments that actually pushed the sport forward for women. And I'm just grateful for other strong women in the industry on both sides, in the workforce, out on the field, people in the events, everything came together for that.
It's time for my first sponsor break, and I'm going to start things out with Peter Glenn Ski and Sports. It's summertime, which means if you live on this planet, it's hotter than ever, and that means it's time to get in the water. And Peter Glenn is the one-stop shop for all of your needs. Think wakeboard, water ski, kneeboard, tubes, swimwear. They have everything to make your summer more fun and functional. And they're a Rollerblade brand dealer, so you can take care of your inline needs as well. Peter Glenn has all the brands, all the products, a knowledgeable staff to help you, and a best-in-class website if you can't make it to their stores. But that's not all. They also have a low price guarantee, free shipping on orders of $50 or more, and a hassle-free return policy, which is very important. Peter Glenn isn't one of those big guys trying to take over an industry. They're the mom and pop shop that you've trusted for almost 70 years. If you like this podcast and want it to keep going, please buy from Peter Glenn Ski and Sports. To find out more, head on over to peterglenn.com. My next sponsor is Rollerblade, the brand that invented inline skates. Rollerblade has been keeping skiers in shape since 1980. If you've listened to this podcast and my interviews with US ski teamers, all of them use Rollerblade branded skates to get where they are today. It's the only all-season sport that mimics the motion of skiing and utilizes the same muscle groups. So really, it's a no-brainer that if you want to get better on your skis, in the park or at speed or anywhere really, inline skating is going to make you better. Remember, running wrecks your knees, and biking is proven not to get your legs in ski shape. If you want to start ski season like you left off last year, download yourself Rollerblade's award-winning Skate to Ski app, pick yourself up a pair of skates, and get to work. You can thank me in early December when you're surprised your ski legs are that strong. To find out more about all things Rollerblade, head on over to rollerblade.com. My final sponsor this round is Stanley, the iconic Northwest brand that invented the category of keeping things hot and cold over 100 years ago. You remember Stanley from your grandfather's green thermos that kept his coffee hot forever when he took you out on adventures. Well, Stanley still makes that bottle and so much more. Think tumblers, water bottles, barware, camping utensils, coolers, vacuum bottles. There really is something for everyone over at Stanley, and you aren't going to find them overpriced like a lot of copycat designer brands that have popped up recently. Stanley is the originator, and they pride themselves on providing you with the best products at the best value. And that value gets even better when you shop with my discount code. When you head on over to stanley1913.com, go shopping. When you check out, enter the code pmovement, that's all one word, all lowercase, and you're going to get 30% off your entire order. Those are my sponsors. Now let's jump back into the podcast. Before we start talking about your whole snowboard career, because we've gotten really far along into it, but we need to reel it all the way back and talk about your early years because they're really different and they're really interesting. You grew up in a house in Fair Oaks, California. It's near Sacramento. It's you, your brother Michael, and you guys are totally different than the rest of the kids. Can you describe how your upbringing was a lot different?
Yeah. My upbringing is what is normal to me.
Sure.
So I look back and I remember being in the moment of our life as kids, and I just feel so blessed to have had such a beautiful childhood. And it was just full of building tree forts and go-karts and BMX bikes and making clubs and big wheels.
No TV, right?
Yeah, like having animals and growing our food and being at this school. The Waldorf curriculum is based on creative thinking and art, and we had no TV growing up. And this is like tube TV with the antennas at that point. This is in the 70s. So the TV was in the closet. We would hop it out. We were allowed to watch cartoons on Saturday mornings. And then we would watch things like Sesame Street or things like that. And then we would watch the Olympics and things like that would come on. And my dad was really into sports, so there'd be sports on here and there.
So you guys did have a little TV. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, we had a little TV, but not until we were like teenagers. We didn't have any TV until we were older.
Because that Waldorf school that you went to, it's one of those places where you don't learn to read until you're a little bit older. And it's mostly, like you said, arts and self-expression. Is it kind of like a total hippie type school, but it's also private?
A lot of people view it as a kind of a hippie school because that is the way of thinking of like connecting with nature. And like even in kindergarten, like you're given big rocks and logs and things to build and play with in the play yard. It's not like a bunch of push toys. You have to actually build the train that you're out, with the sticks and stuff in the yard, and there's sandboxes and swings and things like that. But the way that curriculum focuses on is that you learn when your body's ready to learn. So they focus on creative thinking in like kindergarten years where you are just forced to create your play environment and work together with the other children and play. And you're not learning your alphabet yet. You're not learning numbers yet, like on a chalkboard, but you're learning how to bake bread and measure in a measuring cup and learning motions and hearing poetry and stories. And so you're absorbing the information in a different way, but you're not being drilled and given homework or anything like that. And so we didn't learn our alphabet until first grade. We didn't start writing until first grade. And the reason is because they believe the left and right hemisphere of your brain is just starting to connect, and those connections do not complete their cycle until you're 7 years old. And 7 years old is when you start the next kind of chapter of your growth, which is where you connect both the creative and the other side, so that when you read a book, your brain is not just looking at the shapes of the letters. It actually is reading the book and allowing the other side of your brain to imagine the imagery of what you're reading of the story. And they do tests like this where they have you read jumbled up letters and you're so focused on the shapes that you forget what you just read. And they can prove that it is important for your mind and your brain to be fully developed before you get loaded with information. And so it's such a problem with the current situation of the public school system, is they just are so focused on test scoring because that's how they get money and grants and things. And so they're so focused on that drives them so that they just start jamming information into kindergartens and start testing and homework. And it's just crazy to me to see what's lost when that happens. And they even took like cursive. Nobody learns how to write in cursive anymore.
It's wild. They don't know how to sign their names.
And people are like, oh, they don't need it in their life. When are they ever going to write in cursive? But they don't even think that learning to write in cursive is a exercise to take the thoughts in your brain and the movement to your finger and put it on paper. And that's connecting all these elements. It's not just push button. And I am so fearful of the push button generation, because there is a generation now that is just everything is a click of a button. Everything comes at you really fast. And now it's a problem because they can build robots and AI that will push the buttons for you. So I really believe strongly in the Waldorf education. I'm grateful that my brother and I had that base. It really instilled creativity and thinking outside the box and problem solving and things like that.
Yeah, you have this unique schooling and then you don't have too much TV, but your parents make sure you experience a ton of different things, from like gymnastics to piano to the Bluebirds to 4-H. But with gymnastics, the coaches saw like a real talent in you when you're young. You're like 8 years old. Does that make things go from being fun to almost like work?
Well, it never even happened for me in gymnastics. I was definitely that kid that was into sports. I could throw a mean baseball pitch. I could hit it over the fence. Like I could climb any tree. I could jump my bike off a jump in the driveway. I could run my big wheel down the road. Like I was fearless as a kid. Just my brother and I had endless tree forts and swinging ropes everywhere. That was my livelihood as a child. And so bringing it forward to when I started to focus on certain things like gymnastics, I was really good in gymnastics. I had the balance and grace and bravery to do it. And I got to the point where I was little and I was doing backflips on balance beams, 6 feet up in the air and doing these tricks. And the coach recognized some talent there and said, hey, we want to really start training Tina. She has something here. They train Olympians and they had the whole thing. And so they dove into that. And the thing that I remember is my mom picking me up from my practice, and the coach had duct taped my hair up because I didn't have it in a ponytail. Like she put a piece of tape to hold my hair up. And my mom was like, nope, we're out of here.
Yeah.
This is not okay. That was the end of it. It took the fun out when it became too much of critiquing and training, and I wanted to be free and be a kid and tumble around and do flips on the trampoline and do this. And the second that I was like doing sit-ups and push-ups and training and jog around the gym 5 times, like all of that stuff came in, and it did make it feel different. And I relate that to my snowboarding. My whole snowboarding career, I didn't join the gym until I was retired and realized that I needed to stay in shape. Like
Right.
I wasn't that athlete because we were just living our best life snowboarding. And if we wanted to be a snowboarder, we had to get coverage and get magazine shots and video shots so that we would keep our sponsors exposed and keep it all going. And that's what I wanted to do. If I kept that up, then I got to snowboard for my job. And so of course, we would get up at 6 a.m. and hike in waist deep snow up a mountain to go snowboard down and get a sunrise photo. And hiking up a mountain in 3 feet deep snow is more than any gym workout's going to give you. Like we just stayed in shape because we were snowboarding year round. I didn't have a trainer. I didn't have
There was no jock side to you?
Yeah, it wasn't that professional athlete side of me. I was after it for the thrill of it and to prove myself and make this last as long as possible. But it never got to the point where I had a trainer and I'd go to the gym. And when the Olympics came in as a thought, they're like, snowboarding's being considered for the Olympics. We were like, whoa, we don't wear uniforms. Like, what do you mean? How are we going to do this? We're not athletes like that. And so there was a lot of push against that and things like that. But for me, my path was perfectly balanced with, it felt like fun and it was joyful and thrilling and scary and all the things that came along with it, but it never felt like work. Like it never got to the point where like, oh gosh, I have to go snowboarding again today. Like it never was that for me. Of course, you have fears and things like that that come up, where I got myself in a position where maybe I pushed it a little too far when you're the last one on the top of the mountain in the middle of Alaska and the only way down is hairball. Like I've tumbled down some mountains in Alaska before because I charged into the run too fast. Things like that, where I hit a clump of snow and then I'm just head over heels tumbling down the whole thing thinking I'm going to die.
Right. That's part of the job description, I feel like.
That's part of the lifestyle of it. It's a fine line because that's the hard part of being an athlete in any sport is managing that fine line of risk and reward. And you do not just have the pressure of yourself on you. You have sponsors, the big air competitions at those big events is on a certain day. And being a woman, like if you're having cramps that day or feeling sick or whatever the circumstances is, if you just push hard because there's powder days for 5 days in a row and then you show up and you're like, dang, I'm tired. I got to get this together. And you got to drink water and you got to nourish your body. And like all those factors to come in and be on a certain day is really hard part of being an athlete, especially at the Olympic level, because as an athlete, some days you're on and some days you're off.
And if the off day happens to be the Olympics that you've been training for 4 years, like that's some heavy stuff.
Speaking of heavy stuff, I'm going to reel this back a lot. We're going to go back to your childhood.
Yes.
You had just quit gymnastics, or your mom pulled you out of gymnastics. I think it's around the time you start skateboarding, but we're not really going to talk about skateboarding yet. We're going to talk about your brother, Michael. And he was different. He had things going on that no one could figure out back then. And when did you personally realize that things weren't normal for your brother?
I remember waking up one morning with my mom screaming, and I got up out of bed and I caught the last part of her dragging my brother by his arm down the hallway. I jumped out of bed and she was on the phone with 911 and her whole body was shaking and she was screaming, "He's not breathing, he's not breathing."
Oh, jeez.
And so I was in shock. I didn't know what was happening. The ambulance came and Michael had come to by then, and what he had experienced was a seizure. And so when that happened, I realized that something was off and that it just felt like we needed more care for Michael. So the path that it took is that he actually had to control his seizures. He had spells of time where he did not speak from the medication that he was put on to control the seizures.
Are you guys still hanging out the whole time? Like still best friends, but just not communicating?
Yes, nothing really changed in our routine of what we were doing. We were still building tree forts and playing and building forts in our living room with the curtains and flipping the couches over and collecting stickers and riding my horse and going to play pinball up at the pizza parlor and going to 7-Eleven and getting popsicles and playing baseball, and all those things were still functioning, but the communication was different. We just communicated through what we were doing more than words. And for my family, we embraced that and we met Michael in that world where Michael could still feel our support as a family while the doctors and my parents desperately tried to figure out what the best treatment was for Michael and how to help him overcome this problem of health and overcoming the seizures and what it brought. And so it was a few years of trying to figure that out. And what helped was that we met Michael and stopped treating him like he was sick. And we accepted what was happening as part of life. And he did get off the medicine and he came out of it as outgrowing the seizures. It's kind of just a miracle that it stopped, but he then was seizure free and he was able to get his license. He was able to complete high school. He had the community and the people around him to support him through learning in different ways. So it really took a village to come together for that. And he was able to live a normal life. And there was many doctors who said that he would not live a normal life. So he is a true result and testament to how much love can change and support somebody. And he works in different ways. He's a builder and he communicates well with expressing himself through projects and building and expression of his snowboarding and skills and photography and stuff like that. So it's no surprise that he's going to hold on to those things and keep them throughout his life and continue with those type of connections.
What's wild to me is how your parents seemingly did everything to make life work for you and Michael. Like your mom read that building a house from the ground up would be a good thing for the condition that he was in. So you guys tear down your house and build a new one right there just because that's going to help him?
We were that kind of family. And my parents, they are 100% in for their kids, 100% of the time. They are not selfish in any ways. Always family vacations. I don't even know if they've ever been on a vacation without us. Like it was always family. For Michael, what he needed was building tree forts and building and doing things like that. And that was when we had decided to sell our little house and buy the backyard that was a lot of land. And we decided to build a house and live in a teepee. So
You're the weird kids.
This is not normal behavior for a residential community. Like, we just popped up a teepee and built our house, and we all built our house together. Like, we were hands on, and we had a trampoline, and we had fun stuff. I had a horse, and we had our BMX bikes, and, this was normal to us.
When you grow up in a teepee and people drive by and they see you living in a teepee, it's got to be super odd, right? Just because people don't do that. Do you get teased and stuff?
Well, it's funny because for my first day of high school, I was transitioning from the Waldorf school to a public school, and I chose to go to a public high school because I was interested in sports. And my Waldorf class only had 2 other girls. There was very few girls in that class, for just the odds ended up that way. And they didn't have any sports programs. And so I made the choice to go to a public high school. I wanted to play softball. I wanted to be more active. And sure enough, the sports led to my snowboarding, and the skateboard scene at my high school led to my snowboarding. So I would get up in the teepee and curl my hair with like a butane curling iron and get dressed and walk to the bus stop. Nobody knew I just got out of my teepee.
So it's like a secret?
We lived in it during the summer. So by the time we started moving into the house is when I started my life as a high schooler at a new school with new friends. And so it was kind of like this little bubble of time in that transition for me. And looking back, I remember being in the grocery store line with my mom, and the people in front of us were like, have you seen that family living in a teepee, building their house? And we'd just laugh and like, ha ha ha, that's us. Like I would saddle up my horse and ride it up to 7-Eleven to get a popsicle.
That's crazy.
We were just odd like that.
Yeah, that's
so
sweet.
That just felt normal to me.
It's time for my second sponsor break, and I'm going to start things off with Elon skis. I started telling you about Elon building a cult following in the States about 3 years ago. And if you're like me and heading to the mountain on a weekly basis, I know you've been seeing more Elons by the day. Why? Because they'll make you a better skier. The product that Elon puts into the market is second to none. I mean, Elon's a company that also makes luxury yachts, so you know they're not going to cut corners on materials or production. They're built in Elon's proprietary factory, one of the most sustainable in the world, and the difference in quality is noticeable. Walk up to any ski wall and compare the craftsmanship of an Elon ski to the rest, and there's a difference that you will see and feel. But when you get them on the snow, that's where Elon really shines. From my ripstick models to my new favorite twin tip, the Playmaker, Elon keeps making better and more fun skis every year. If you want to have more fun on the mountain next year, head on over to elonskis.com and find the pair that's best for you. My final sponsor is Best Day Brewing. And I'll tell you, I've been loving having Best Day as a sponsor, as it's really helped me change my ways. See, I'm a binge drinker. While I don't drink that often, when I do, I put a bunch back. And my issue is that, like with everything, I drink way too fast, and within a couple of hours, I need to go home because the alcohol has gotten the best of me. But not anymore. Now I'm managing my fun time by making sure that every other beer I drink a Best Day. And by doing that, I've been having my best days and nights ever. I can stay out longer, I'm coherent, happy, and I don't feel like crap in the morning. And they taste so good. I'll put a Best Day Hazy IPA up against any alcoholic IPA in a blind taste test, and you won't be able to tell which is which. On top of that, Best Days are only like 60 calories, which, like drinking less alcohol, is something that I think about these days. While I'm not asking you to quit drinking by any means, please support me and your health by heading over to bestdaybrewing.com and order a 6-pack or 2. Those are my sponsors. Now let's jump back into the podcast. Skateboarding, you get into it, it sounds like when you first get into high school. And are those like the early Bones Brigade era kind of times?
When I got to high school, coming from Waldorf, so I went from a class of like 20 children to a class of 500 kids in a school of 2,000 kids. And here I am, kind of the odd artist type kid hitting this mainstream public school. I remember things like being in class and they would pass out Xerox copies of things and you just had to fill in the blanks. And I'm like, really? They don't want me to write an essay and put it on rice paper and calligraphy and illustrate a drawing, or we're not going to have a play about it? Like just all this Waldorf way was not there. And so I felt a little bit like high school was easier to me. So for me, I was all of a sudden in this sea of people with the jocks and the cheerleaders and the skateboarders and the punk rockers, all these different people. And what I gravitated to was the skateboarders. And I don't know if it was because they were most accepting and more open to be whoever you wanted to be, because we were just kind of the misfits, but that's who I was attracted to. And I had a great group of friends of skateboarders in high school and still my friends today, many of them. And the skateboarding part of it led to snowboarding because my mom saw a snowboard at the Big Five sporting goods store, had one, and it was a Burton Elite 150 with the fins and the big red stiff 2-foot high binding thing, and not 2 feet high, but those big high backs and things, and there's seatbelt kind of straps. And because we were skateboarders, she said, "Oh, there's this thing called a snowboard. I think you kids would love it." And that kind of was the introduction to snowboarding. And we just thought, oh, this is like skateboarding on snow, or you stand sideways. And it attracted to me right away. And what happened for me is that when we hit the hills and started meeting other snowboarders, they were all skateboarders. It wasn't the surfers and it wasn't the skiers crossing over it. We were all skateboarders. So instantly just became a community. Anytime you met a snowboarder up at Donner Ski Ranch in those early days, we all became best friends, and we kind of instantly fell in love with snowboarding together. And it was that crossover from skateboarding.
This is when, if you were part of a crew of skateboarders, you were automatically looked at like you were a dirtbag. I mean, were your friends the ones that had mohawks and different color hair when that actually meant something?
Yeah, we were the misfits, but we kind of prided ourselves in that because I didn't relate to being a cheerleader or, that was kind of like, where do you fit in? And so anything goes with punk rock. You could have green hair and a mohawk and spray paint on your jeans. We'd pour bleach on our jeans and acid wash everything and patches. And my first snowboarding outfit, had a Thrasher patch, an independent truck sewn on my thrift store ski coat. There wasn't really too much snowboarding gear. So, we wanted to look different than the skiers. So it never dawned on me to go buy a pair of ski pants. I wouldn't be cut dead in a pair of ski pants on my snowboard. I would wear my jeans and get soaking wet instead. We didn't want to be skiers. We wanted to be something different. That was part of the attraction, was how different it made you feel. And we were on gear back then that was challenging. So the second that metal edges was developed, we could be better and we could carve and we could do things. And it was just exciting times back then.
Yeah, when you started, it was an inflexible plank of wood with fins, like you said. And if it was bulletproof, those fins wouldn't dig in. You'd kind of be riding up on top of it. And then if it was softer, you could sink down in it. It was really hard to flex the board and make a turn. When you think about your career, what year did you finally get a board that actually worked? Where you get a board from a sponsor and you're like, holy shit, my snowboarding's now different because I've got a board that works.
I think it was when Tom Sims handed me my first free board, and it was a Sims pocket knife.
Okay.
It was a 135 and it was small and light. And before that, I had been riding the Kidwell. It was kind of a tank.
Like the 1500 model kind of thing?
Probably. It was all black. And I didn't own one of those boards. Mike Chantry flowed me a borrow on a Kidwell, and it did have a rounded tail, but it was a tank. And so when I got on that Sims pocket knife, back then we would be into ollieing, because we were skateboarders. So just going down the hill and just kind of ollieing up in the air was cool.
Yep.
That was a trick, right? So I couldn't ollie that Terry Kidwell very high because it was pretty heavy. But once I got that pocket knife, I could kind of ollie. I could pop off a jumps better. I could actually lift the board up to my body to grab a method quicker so I could hold it longer, things like that. And I just remember having the first feeling. I was at Donner Ski Ranch and I went off a cat track and I brought my board up to me and just did a full-on briefcase air, but I kind of floated it for just a second. And that was the difference, because up until then, I was just pulling my board up and kind of tapping it. And then I was already on the ground. Like I wasn't getting much air. So that's when I kind of started to get enough air to kind of start floating some tricks and grabbing tricks. Cause back then it was like, oh, I'm going to try a different trick, which meant instead of a method, I was going to try a tail grab. Like that's the different tricks. Like my bag of trick was like a tail grab, an indie grab, a briefcase, or a cross rocket, or a slob. And then in a half pipe, I would try like an alley-oop or a layback slide. Like that was my bag of tricks. And that's what I won contests doing. I mean, really, the half pipes back then were such highway hits. It was a feat just to get down to the bottom without falling, because you were just, the more air you got, the more you had to pull in to try and land on some transition of some sort instead of getting flung out of the pipe.
So that pocket knife is the first board that you have that actually performs and lets you ride well. And I don't mean to jump around when we're talking about tech or lack thereof tech in snowboarding early on. But when you're at the peak of your career, it seems like the big innovation was step-ins. Were you forced to ride them by sponsors ever?
I've never ridden step-ins.
Oh.
I've never ridden them. I've only ridden high back bindings and boots that I lace up. Like I've never even had a pair of twisty, whatever that little
the boa
thing is, the boa thing. I've never had that. So I've really, I mean, Capita sent me the art board that they did, which was so awesome. And Union Bindings sent me some bindings, and I got hand-me-down boots from Shannon, some Burton boots, and just kind of updated my setup, but I haven't had any flow of step-ins or tried any of that stuff. And it's so funny to me because by the time I quit snowboarding in the early 2000s as a career, that gear was awesome. That got me on the board. That got me carving, turning, air, whatever I wanted to. So whatever innovations happened past that, I'm kind of unaware of. You know, like up until I had that Capita board in 2021, I just rode my board from 2001. And it was funny. I went up to Baldface to film for the movie that Leanne made, that all girls movie, Full Moon. And they gathered about 18 women from different eras of snowboarding to ride together. So I was there, and Barrett Christy and Jamie Anderson was there, and there was just a bunch of different people. There's pipe riders, powder riders, jibbers from different eras. And so I show up, and they're like, hey, bring your old board if you want. It'd be cool to get some shots of you on your old snowboard. And so I show up, and we get off the heli, and we get into the lodge, and everybody's unpacking their board bags so that we can just line up our boards by the door. And I pull out my GNU snowboard that Barrett had gifted me. They did a Boarding for Breast Cancer edition that had one of my artwork flowers on it, a poppy, and it was from 2001, I think. And so I pull out that board, and they're like, that's so cool that you brought your old board. And I'm like, oh, this isn't my old board. So I pull out that board, I put it on, I'm like, this is my old board. And I pull out my pocket knife, and they're like, what's that? like, like, that's my old board, is the one I got in 85. Like, 86, 87, like those are my old boards. Like, it's so funny. And then I realized, like, oh, I guess this board is 17 years old. I guess that would be an old board. It's not to me, but that was the one I was still riding. So it's so funny because some people are top pro snowboarders that don't know the history of where it comes from and didn't know that we had to push through. And Shannon had a conversation with Chloe Kim one time explaining how when she was an Olympian in 96, that her mom couldn't even find the coverage of the women's half pipe. And it was on at like 3 a.m. Like they didn't highlight it. And Chloe had no idea. She's like, what do you mean? Everybody watches. It's like on Sunday night. And, you know, you see all the commercials. How would you not know when it's on? Like it wasn't highlighted like that. So there are so many growing pains to snowboarding until it got to where it is today that I think it's so important to continue to share our stories like this to remind people that we did have boards with fins like a surfboard, and we weren't allowed on ski resorts, and there was no such thing as a high school snowboarding team, or there's no such thing as coaches, and there was no such thing as women's specific equipment. Like those things exist because the people were in place that pushed through to get those things going and put the motivation through the companies and
actually made it happen and pushed through. And I am so grateful to have been in that chapter of snowboarding because I feel like it was so exciting and I just wouldn't trade it for anything. It was such a special time.
And in that chapter, I was asking you about step-ins because that's when step-ins started to hit the market in 1997, 98, 99. And it was looked at as an inferior product by the core snowboarding market. But to the general consumer, it seemed like the convenient way to get people into snowboarding. I think the manufacturers are like, we're going to print money when we start getting these bindings and we turn skiers into snowboarders and we make it easy for them. But there were a lot of snowboarders, not a lot, but I know of a handful of snowboarders that were actually paid a little bit more to ride those step-ins to make them look legitimate. You weren't one of those people. You actually never rode it. But if we go back to the roots of snowboarding and some of the things that really changed things, the things that Chloe Kim doesn't know about, it's all about riding Donner Ski Ranch for you. And that's when you're in high school. And that's where the roots of snowboarding really start, at least in Tahoe area. And we describe the Donner Ski Ranch and why it's so important to snowboarding for those that don't know.
So imagine yourself falling in love with snowboarding. Like you're all about it. Like we would stand on our snowboards in our living room, just grabbing our boards in different ways or laying on the ground, like tweaking our grabs. Like we were so pumped on snowboarding and then going up to the ski resorts and them saying you're not allowed at the resorts. We don't allow snowboarding. And what happened is Norm Sayers at Donner Ski Ranch welcomed us. Sure. We had to have a leash, I think, back then, which some people might not even remember what that means, but there was it's like a surf leash that was connected to our bindings and we would put it around our calf.
Anybody who saw a board go down the mountain out of control remembers why they had leashes.
Yes. I mean, it was two things. When you got off the lift and you had one binding connected, you would put the other foot on. But if we wanted to hike up to something, we would take the board off and there would be runaway boards. Or if the bolts, like a lot of the old boards, we would just drill right into the board to have the stance we wanted.
Yep.
You know, I would want a narrower stance. So a lot of times I would T-bolt it through the board because if you just drilled it in, it would rip out and you could get hurt. So like if you would fall and crash and rip out the bindings, like the board would go flying down the hill. Stuff like that would happen. So they did have safety precautions back in those days, like a leash, or you'd have to be certified, things like that. But the vibe at Donner Ski Ranch is that we were completely welcome at that resort. And then being a snowboarder on the resort, you would be riding with skiers. And the general reaction to snowboard was that we were out of control. And we were a little out of control. I mean, if you go and try and ride a board with fins right now, you'd look like we did back then. You could hardly hold your balance. You've got your arms spread out, kind of crouched down like surfing. And, you know, you're not just laying into arched turns. So I get some of that. It was, we were out of control, but because we had mohawks and whatever and green hair and swearing or whatever, listening to punk rock music as we pulled up into the parking lot and, you know, on our cassette tapes and whatever, like we were those rebel misfit kids and we got it, but we kind of thrived on it a little bit. But so very thankful for that crew at Donner Ski Ranch, and the people that gathered there were just genuine, true, authentic people. Like Mike Chantry had a big impact on my career.
That guy's a legend behind the scenes of snowboarding.
Yeah, he knew the people to talk to. He got me hooked up with Sims, and Don Bostic was so connected through the skateboarding and was the early organizers of those events back then and promoted snowboarding. And just the crew of like Chris Roach and Monty Roach and Tucker Franson and Mike Jacoby and Devin Ryerson and Heather Mills and Angie and Lori Dominguez and just all those people. And then the Avalanche crew like Damian Sanders and Bev, and, you know, we'd see Terry Kidwell and Sean Palmer come through every once in a while, but they were riding at Homewood, who had also allowed snowboarding kind of on the South Shore. It was just so exciting. Like every time you went snowboarding, you would run into that crew. And, you know, we were high schoolers, so we would just flock to the mountain on Saturday, Sundays, and everybody was doing the same thing. And we were getting rides with each other and borrowing our parents' car and trying to get up there and gas money and pitching in. And
We would buy a season pass for $99 back then and just be in our element, learning new tricks and seeing who duct taped their bindings different. Like, oh my gosh, Dave Sione would have some contraption on his binding and duct taped padding on the back, or we'd have grip tape for stomp pads. From skateboarding, we just stick a bunch of grip tape in our board so we'd have something to grip when we get off the lifts. And it was just such an exciting time. And it wasn't until I went to the 87 World Championships in Breckenridge that I even realized that there was anybody snowboarding anywhere else. Like, I just thought we were in our own little bubble.
The 87 Worlds in Breck, I think that's where everybody comes together and realizes, holy shit, this sport is way bigger than we thought it was, and the level of riding is way higher than we thought it was. But before that, your first contest, I think you end up with a third place finish and an ambulance ride. Can you take us through what happened your first comp?
Yes, the first competition was Raging at the Ranch at Donner Ski Ranch, and there was a half pipe. The walls might have been like 2.5 feet.
Right, all hand dug and chunky.
All hand dug. And it was made from a snowcat that ran down through the middle to give us kind of sides. And what happened is they pushed all the snow from the middle down to the bottom. So at the bottom there was this chunk of snow. So people like shoveled and made this like booter at the end. So I was at the top and I hadn't gone off the jump at the bottom. I mean, I was on my Burton Elite going down. And so my big trick was going to be an alley-oop at the end. And I was just going to try and slash the edges, just go up and go down and just get all the way down.
Yeah.
And there was just a handful of girls in that competition. And I'm at the top. Mike Jacoby goes, hey, if you want to win, just hit the kicker at the bottom. And I was like, ooh. So I went down, and instead of hitting all the hits all the way down the half pipe, I cut off after 4 hits and just beelined it to the bottom and just flew off this jump with too much speed and just went flat on my back, just landed flat on my back past the landing. And they had to bring up a stretcher and put me in, but I had already gotten enough points to earn a placing, but I just went for it. And those early days of winning and getting that feeling, it was different than me winning with my softball team or winning with my soccer team. This is something that I was tackling and myself, even though I was part of this community. And so it really pushed me. I wanted to get better and win more contests. It was so much of a thrill. So taking me to that first contest in Breckenridge, that was an eye opener where there were people wearing gear for the giant slalom to bash gates, and they had racing equipment and asymmetrical boards and things happening, and watching Amy Howitt drop into the half pipe and do a slaw bear, 1.5 foot out of the lip, where I was just having trouble dropping in without falling. So that contest really opened my eyes to what was possible. And then I think that really just kickstarted my drive to get after it.
Well, thinking about that contest and all the contests back then, you had your 3 and 4 foot hand dug half pipes, but then there was racing shit too. And was that strange that you guys had this cool sport that you're creating its own culture, and then part of the culture that you're creating is a ripoff of a ski race, a sport that doesn't respect snowboarding at all? Was it weird that you guys were doing something that skiers did?
I never thought of racing as what skiers did, but some of us were like, oh, it's lame because you can't tweak your board. Or I remember some contests where the racers would come and drop through the half pipe and we're like, oh my gosh, they're crushing the lip because they couldn't ride the half pipe in the hard boots, and they just come carve it up and trash it almost. So at some point for us, it was all about the tricks. When we would go to a contest, if we had gas money and entry fee and we were at a contest and you got to win prizes or money, and there was a giant slalom, a slalom, and a half pipe, of course we were entering all three. That's what the entry fee included. And we had a chance to win money or product. Of course we were going to just do all the events. I competed in moguls. I competed in something called an obstacle course, which then led to be the slope style. We would bonk trash cans, and then we'd go on a bank turn, and then we'd go on whoop-dees. We were just kind of inventing everything that was possible that they could provide for us. So I did all of it up until it became clear that people were then focusing on racing or focusing on half pipe. And what that did is that the people that started doing that were winning because they were just focused on one thing. So when Burton had the Cross M team, that was kind of the first glimpse of a team that had a coach. They would videotape their runs, they'd critique it at night and watch, and then they'd have somebody that gave them an opinion, and they would do dryland training and all this stuff. And we were like, whoa, that's kind of weird that they're doing that, but then they are the ones that are winning the contest in their discipline. So then I let go of racing because I wasn't going to do that. That wasn't my style. I was more about the tricks, and I didn't see any value in doing lunges up and down the driveway at the hotel parking lot. Like, I wasn't that person. So it wasn't for me. So I went towards the freestyle, of course, because I was so hyped on doing tricks and airs. And for me, my training was just doing it all the time. So we would actually go to Mount Hood in the summer times and ride half pipes and be paid as a coach. And then we could ride, that's how I got better, was just doing it more and trying new tricks. And when the pipe dragon came on, that really gave us a consistent surface that we could learn a trick on a pipe dragon pipe at Mount Hood and then show up to the Rocky Mountain series and actually do our same run. That consistency of that pipe dragon really helped progress the riding.
But pre-pipe dragon, you're still towards the end of high school, and I feel like you're living a double life. Like, you're a snowboarder on the weekends and doing contests and going with all your skateboard type crew and the tribe that you found. But then you go back to high school and it's back to high school life. Do they know about your snowboarding, or is it totally separate?
It was the same crew because it was a skateboard crew. So during the week, we were skateboarders and hanging out at Go Skate and hanging out behind the B of A because they had the best curb. And so we were that during the week, and then we were snowboarders on the weekend. But my first publication that I ever was published in print was my high school newspaper. So there it is on the cover of the paper of our high school newsletter, and it says, "Shred Betty's head to snowboard comp."
What a title right there.
And then the first line, it says, "Shred Betties are girls who snowboard," or something like that. Like, they had to define what a Shred Betty was. That was it. Like, we were the Shred Betties, like the token girls that snowboarded. And they explained in the article about how we went to the world championships in Colorado and that I placed 16th in the giant slalom and 6th in the half pipe, or whatever my results were. And that was a big deal. And so we were known as the snowboarders. I was proud of it in our high school. But when you're in a high school of 2,000 kids, like, the skateboarders are the ones that knew what it was all about. Like, the cheerleaders didn't know what snowboarding was all about.
For sure.
So we kind of stuck to our own groups, our own tribe of people back then.
And then when you're getting ready to graduate high school, you have a big choice to make. It's like sign a contract and join the Kemper snowboard team, which I would think is like a dream for you, or sign a scholarship and go to Santa Cruz College and study art. Was it an easy decision to make to follow snowboarding?
It was an easy decision to make. And I think the biggest thing was that my parents allowed me to make that decision and gave me the support and just said, "Tina, follow your heart." That was such a pivotal moment for me because I set off on an adventure in that moment as a young adult of leading my life with what I loved. And that permission to do so is just the thread of my life. Like, I feel like my life is full of things that I love to do because I wasn't held back by, you have to go to college and you have to get the job that gives you money and you have to become this. There was no pressure like that from my parents.
You have Waldorf-style parents, right?
Yeah, it is just open mind and recognizing what's important. And for me, snowboarding was important. And then also snowboarding is what gave my brother his voice. And my parents and my family had that experience where my brother was going through epilepsy He wasn't speaking. He wasn't communicating well with words. And snowboarding gave him his confidence and gave him his voice. And that shifted everything for us. So my brother's love for snowboarding gave him something that he was good at because he was behind in every other level of reading and writing and schoolwork and all of those things he was challenged with doing. And then here's snowboarding that he was shining in. And my parents saw what snowboarding did for him.
Like his self-confidence and everything?
Yeah. And it was obvious what value that brought. And so when it came down to us choosing snowboarding as an adult and going for it and seeing where this led, there was no hesitation. It was just, let's go for it. And I still went to college. I went to UC Davis and did a certificate program for graphic design. And there was things that I was interested in photography and classes and like that. And so I would do that in the summer and in the falls when there wasn't snow. And graphic design and Photoshop and all that, I use that even to this day in my wholesale business that I have, and used it throughout my snowboarding career to create graphics and help with ads and designs and clothing designs and laying out stuff. And so I really was thankful, and part of that was taking every opportunity in my snowboarding career to kind of use all those elements that I enjoyed.
Well, the last thing we're going to talk about really in this first part of 2 is talking about you getting flowed by different companies. Now, we talked about, I just said that you were going to sign a contract with Kemper, and that's what you did instead of going to college right away. But before you were on Kemper, you had Go Skate paying for some contrast entry fees, but Sims comes along and flows you boards. And I would think when you get your first sponsorship package from Sims, it's like one of those, I always say shit your pants moments, and I don't know why I always say that, but it's got to be one of those mind-blowing things that happens in your life when someone sends you $1,000 worth of product and it's for free because you're good at what you do.
Yeah, it was like Christmas morning all the time. Like getting a box of gear in the mail, it was like waiting for it, open the box, and like, no way, look at this. Oh, they sent extra stickers. All of that was just like so exciting. And when it started to be a time where I had a board sponsor and a boot sponsor and an outerwear sponsor and goggles and gloves. And so I had like boxes from Fish Paw, gloves coming. And then at Christmas, Fish Paw sent us go-karts, like as a surprise. And like we'd go ripping around our neighborhood on these go-karts and going on photo shoots for Airwalk, and even being in like not just all snow, like I got to do some fashion stuff that was fun, and like hair and makeup was new, and like not being just such a tomboy in the prom days of dressing up and being girly, and like getting to design gear and then get that box in the mail was like a whole other level of rewarding feeling. And so when it shifted to then getting paid for doing what I was doing, then that was like, oh wow, I took it seriously. Like I was, a really hard worker as a pro snowboarder, and took it seriously and never partied too hard or, went down that path. And just, I didn't want to risk my snowboarding because I wanted to do this as long as possible. Like I saw people come and go because they partied too hard or they broke too much stuff in the hotel room, and Sim was like, you're out, like that's not okay. And so the thrill of being a pro snowboarder from the beginning of my career to the end of my career was just thrilling the whole time. Getting gear in the mail, getting checks in the mail, winning prize money, like being on ESPN, having people want to interview you, and MTV road trips, and just all of that stuff was just, it all just made such a hype and such a heyday being in my 20s doing all that stuff. Like it was just the time of my life at the right time of my life.
So cool. So that is part 1 of our podcast, but that doesn't mean we're done. I finish every show with something I call inappropriate questions. And I get someone that they can ask 3 questions and they can be anything. And I'm really excited as I was able to get another living legend and former podcast guest, former peer of yours, Barrett Christy, to ask the 3 questions. And are you ready for question number 1 from Barrett?
Yes.
Hi, Tina. Oh, you and I have had so many great trips together. One of our trips, we were on a road trip with MTV. We went hellying together and we were hitting a cornice together with our crew. My memory is a little blurry from that session. I'm pretty sure you and I both ended up knocking ourselves silly and sitting on the sidelines. Can you share your side of that story?
First, was this MTV Sports with Dan Cortez?
I'm not recalling exactly what trip that was on, but I do recall two girls having a conversation with both of us having concussions, and we just kept repeating ourselves over and over again. I think Barrett had a big gash across her nose, and I hit my eye, and I remember other people saying, "Hey, you guys keep asking the same questions," or something like that. It seems like Barrett and I have been together a few times, banged up, because I remember being the first one to run up to her after she crashed at one of the X Games where she was still competing and I had stopped competing at that point. And I went with her into the first aid room. And I remember having enough experience to say, "Barrett, you hit your head." And it was like the fourth time I had told her this. And I said, "There's going to be an emotional part that's going to come. Just be ready for it." Because I remember knowing that when you actually realize that you can't remember, like how you got to the mountain or things like that, that you start freaking out. And then she started to have that recognition because the doctor said, "Do you remember how you got to the mountain today?" Just to kind of test how bad she hit her head. And I remember crying with her, almost like being there with her, holding her. And I think that Barrett and I have had a couple situations like that where we've been there for each other, black and blue or banged up. And it just kind of came with the territory of pushing ourselves. And I'm so thankful that we were getting banged up from jumping 20 feet off a cornice or off a jump, where nowadays it's so scary. The consequences are so high because they're just, going off 70-foot jumps in the slope style and things like that. It just scares me watching it almost.
I hear you completely. And is it something that you think about? Like, hey, I've hit my head 50 times over my career. And you read about and hear about all the CTE stuff in the NFL. You see it with Dave Mira. And shit happens. I mean, we didn't know about it a long time ago. People didn't wear helmets in the beginning. Is it something that you're concerned about? Is all the hits that you've taken to the head?
I feel like I lucked out with my injuries. I've definitely slammed many times, probably gotten a few concussions, and didn't wear a helmet. Like, I look back on the footage of me just flying down the mountain in Alaska, just whipping past rocks and cliffs and not wearing a helmet. And it's just so odd to me now, looking back, that we didn't protect ourselves like that. So I feel very lucky that I got out of my career with a few concussions and a broken tib in my ankle and a bashed in eye socket. And I'm okay, because a lot of people did not fare as well. I watch the level of riding these days and just can't fathom the headspace that they have to be in, knowing that they're truly put themselves in life or death situations with avalanches or the airtime they're getting or the half pipe. How many of our peers have not been so lucky with injuries and even death? I'm thankful that I'm in the chapter of snowboarding that I was in, that it was not so extreme.
All right, we were going to jump into question number 2.
Tina, you have always been so supportive, mentorship, and always felt the love and support from you, even when we were competing against each other. I remember you giving me some advice about investments way back when, and I just thought, wow, nobody talked about money back then, but you were smart and you were planning for the future. I'm wondering, how did those funds perform for you? And are you still living off the money from those snowboard earning days?
I grew up being the kid that was like saving my money in my piggy bank and hiding my money in between my books on my bookshelf. So I've always been kind of a saver and planner. And I felt
like my snowboarding money came in such chunks of money that was so surprising to me to like win $10,000 or things like that was just so crazy to me. I lived a pretty simple life. I had roommates always. And so I was really good at saving all that prize money. And I feel very fortunate because the home that I live in, I would never be able to just afford this house now or qualify for the loan now with the prices of houses in California. And I feel so lucky because I was able to get into real estate and buy my first condo in Utah for $38,000 back in the early 90s. And that condo doubled in value, and I sold that and bought my home that was housed to Adam Yauch and Dave Downey in Sandy, Utah. And then I sold that and kind of moved my way up. And I do feel very lucky that now I get to live in my little dream house in my small little town and community. And it's a 150-year-old Victorian that's restored. And I feel very much that it is my snowboard money that brought me this dream life of living in my sweet little town.
That's awesome. What's the coolest toy you bought when you're in your 20s with your snowboard money?
My snowboard money bought me a 1962 Impala drop top convertible in 95 that was so sick. And I held on to that for a long time. I actually just sold it last year, and that was a good investment. I went through a Snoop Dogg phase and lowered it and put smoothie rims on it and some big white walls. And we drove it up to Mount Hood one time and would roll around government camp in that. And it was in a couple snowboarding ads and features. And that was kind of my biggest spend on a toy. But I think it more you grow in your life and get older, you realize you don't need quite so many toys. And it's actually nice to have a little bit simpler of a life to live with a little less stress. So I'm more after less is more and not having so much leveraged money wise. I'm more of a simple person of trying to save up for something and then buy it when I have the money.
The older, more mature version of yourself, but in the 20s, man, you needed that drop top, and that's pretty sick. We're going to go to your final inappropriate question.
Inappropriate. So you used to hang out with all the greats. We're talking Hetzel, Palmer, Beastie Boys, Dave Grohl, Peter Line, MFM, all of them. And those guys knew how to party, and I never saw you messed up. I never saw you wasted doing dumb things that you might regret later. Always in control. What was your secret, and how did you avoid the chaos? And were you ever really up and just didn't let it show?
It's so funny because when you're a snowboarder, like even as my adult self now in my 50s, and I'll be at a friend's house or a dinner party or meet somebody new and talking about what we do. And I say, oh, I used to be a professional snowboarder. And they're like, really? What was that like? And a lot of people just assume that snowboarders are just partiers and ragers and whatever. And for me, I was thick in the middle of those scenes of just late night and partying, and just something in me, maybe I didn't want to let go of the control too much, but mostly I just wanted to take care of my friends. And so I quickly became the sober driver or get you out of jail free card or whatever it was. Like I became the caretaker of a lot of people, and I always had the home that housed anybody who would want to come and stay. And so like in the Utah days, we would drive a half hour to go down into town to go out at Bricks or those bars and play pool and party and drink and have fun and let loose. And I was just the driver, and I was the driver in high school too. Like I would drive around the skateboarder boys, and the guys would get in fights, and I'd go out earlier and start the car because I knew it was coming. Like I was just like the getaway car. So I look back and am thankful that I was responsible in my life, and I did let my hair down and party at trade shows and things like that. But I never to this day have ever done drugs. I've never gone down any path like that before. That's never been appealing to me or any need to escape that far or whatever that means to people. But I've always just been, I guess, a light partier and, cocktails at the Hard Rock Cafe during the Vegas trade show and whoop whoop on the dance floor and making sure everybody gets home or whatever. And so it was enough of a party scene for me to just watch shit go down.
Well, it sounds like you're the ultimate team player, and I will say that that is part 1 of the podcast right there, and that's Inappropriate Questions as well. And we will connect in a couple days, and we can go through part 2 where we talk about sponsorship and your whole pro career, because you had such a unique upbringing that I felt like it was really important to talk about that a bit, because it kind of defines who you are, and it'll come through in the next podcast and through your whole life. So for now, I want to thank you for part 1, and thank you for your time, and I look forward to chatting again.
Thank you so much. Talk soon.
So that was part 1 with Tina Basich. And what I really like about Tina and this podcast is that she's so thoughtful in her answers. I can tell she cared about this interview. And I'm guessing that's because of her hippie-style Waldorf schooling that makes you think and go above and beyond the call of duty. There are no simple answers with Tina, and we get so much information. And really, this part of the podcast was more to get Tina's interesting background. Next week, we dive into the fun and sometimes crazy life that she led, that featured a cast of characters that included Adam Yount and Dave Grohl, plus all the legends in snowboarding. So that's the podcast. At this point, I want to thank you for listening, and I want to ask you to rate me wherever you listen to the show. Rating takes about 10 seconds, and all you do is star rate the podcast based on how good it is. Reviewing, if you do that, that takes another minute. But if you review the show and I read your review on the podcast, I'm going to send you a prize. All you need to do is email me at mike@thepowellmovement.com with your address if I read your stuff on the air, and I will send you something, and it's going to be awesome. Rating and reviewing helps me move up the charts based on something that they call an algorithm, and that's why I'm asking you to do it. So thank you for that, and thank you for supporting my amazing sponsors. They are Stanley, Rollerblade, Elon Skis, Best Day Brewing, and Peter Glenn Ski and Sports. Have a great week, everyone.